Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever walked through a crowded room, performing a vital task, and been looked straight through, as if you were nothing more than a ghost in a uniform? We build our world on hierarchies, on titles and corner offices, on suits and credentials. We decide who is important and who is not, who gets a voice and who must remain silent. But what if the most important voice in the room belongs to the one person nobody is listening to? What if the key to unlocking a multi-million-dollar problem is held in the hands of the person who cleans the floors? This is the story of a woman who was seen as nothing, and the day she proved she was everything. Her name was Elena, and her story begins in the sterile, echoing hallways of a company that had forgotten how to listen. Harrison Dynamics was a titan of innovation, a place where genius was supposedly nurtured, where the future was forged in humming labs and frantic, whiteboard-covered conference rooms. Yet, for all its brilliance, the company was failing. Its crown jewel, the project that was meant to secure its legacy for another generation, was a catastrophic, sputtering mess. The Helios engine, a revolutionary power source, refused to work. Millions of dollars, thousands of man-hours, and the company's entire reputation were burning away with every failed test. The air in the building was thick with the stench of quiet panic, a tension that coiled in the guts of every employee from the boardroom to the mailroom. And every night, after the brilliant minds had gone home, defeated, Elena would arrive. She was a phantom in a gray jumpsuit, her cart of supplies her only companion. Her job was to erase the day's failures, to wipe away the frantic, useless equations from the whiteboards, to mop up the coffee spills left by anxious engineers, to empty the trash cans filled with crumpled schematics and shattered hopes. She was 42 years old, with eyes that held a quiet, weary intelligence. Her hands, though chapped and calloused from bleach and detergents, moved with a deliberate, gentle grace. Most people who passed her saw only the uniform. They didn't see the woman who had spent her childhood in her father's garage, learning the language of machines not from textbooks, but from the grease on her knuckles and the hum of a perfectly tuned engine. Her father had been a mechanic, a magician who could coax life back into dying metal. Listen, he would tell her, his voice a low rumble over the clatter of tools. Every machine tells you a story, Elle. It tells you where it hurts. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. He was gone now, and all she had left of him were those lessons, memories that felt as useless as a foreign language in a world that only valued degrees on a wall. So she cleaned. She kept her head down, her thoughts to herself. But she listened. She listened to the hushed, desperate conversations in the hallways. She heard the jargon, the theories, the complex analyses. And as she wiped down the gleaming, silent shell of the Helios engine in its pristine lab each night, she listened to it too. And the engine, in its silence, was telling her a story that none of the brilliant engineers could hear. It spoke of a pain, a subtle, rhythmic shudder that was too small for their sophisticated sensors to flag as critical, but to Elena, it felt like a scream. She could feel it in the soles of her worn-out shoes, a tiny, discordant vibration that sang of imbalance. One evening, she saw the lead engineer, Marcus Vance, storm out of the lab, his face a mask of thunder. He was a man who wore his Ivy League education like a suit of armor, and he treated anyone without his credentials with a thinly veiled contempt. He threw a stack of printouts onto a nearby table, and one fluttered to the floor. Elena stooped to pick it up. It was a diagnostic report, a cascade of data she didn't fully understand. But at the bottom, there was a schematic of a small, secondary component, a tertiary coolant pump. Her eyes traced the lines, the flow of energy. And then she saw it. A tiny detail, a notation about the housing bracket, something that seemed insignificant. But connected to the vibration she felt, it was everything. It was a misalignment, a flaw so fundamental, so simple, that it was being completely overlooked. They were searching for a complex software bug, a catastrophic material failure, when the problem was a simple case of something not being screwed on straight. Her heart hammered in her chest. To say something would be to invite ridicule, to risk her job, the only thing that kept a roof over her head. She was the janitor. Her opinion was worth less than the dirt she swept away. She crumpled the paper in her hand, her father's voice echoing in her memory. The biggest problems, he'd said, often have the smallest, simplest answers. The silence of the lab pressed in on her. The magnificent, failed engine stood before her like a fallen god. And in that moment, a quiet resolve hardened within her. She couldn't let them fail, not when she knew the answer. She smoothed out the wrinkled schematic, walked over to a workbench and found a grease pencil. Her hand trembled as she circled the problematic housing bracket. Then, on a clean rag, she wrote 5 simple, anonymous words. Check the tertiary coolant pump alignment. She placed the rag on the main control console, a silent message in a bottle, and slipped back into the shadows of the hallway, her cart squeaking softly as she disappeared. The next morning, the lab was a hive of renewed anxiety. It was David, a junior engineer with perpetually worried eyes and a desperate need to prove himself, who found the rag. He stared at the grease-stained words, confused. He almost threw it away, assuming it was a prank or a mistake. But desperation was a powerful motivator. Their last test had been a disaster, and Marcus was blaming him for miscalibrating a sensor array. With nothing to lose, he pulled up the schematics for the tertiary coolant pump on his terminal. He ran a microvibrational analysis on the housing, a diagnostic so specific and minor that no one had ever bothered to run it before. The results that filled his screen made him jolt in his chair. A red line spiked violently across the graph, indicating a harmonic resonance far outside of acceptable parameters. It was exactly what the note implied. The vibration was off-axis, creating a cascading effect that was slowly tearing the engine apart from the inside out. He felt a surge of adrenaline and fear. He knew he couldn't show this to Marcus, who would just dismiss it and berate him for wasting time on a janitor's note, so he broke protocol. He printed the results, grabbed the greasy rag, and walked directly to the top floor, to the office of the CEO, Mr. Arthur Harrison. Harrison was a man living on the edge of a precipice. He had staked his family's company, his entire legacy, on the Helios engine. He looked up from his desk, his face etched with exhaustion, as the nervous young engineer laid the printout and the dirty rag on his polished mahogany desk. "Sir," David stammered, "I think we found something." Harrison listened, his initial impatience slowly morphing into a sharp, focused intrigue. He wasn't an engineer, but he was a brilliant businessman, and his greatest skill was pattern recognition. He saw the pattern of failure, of his lead engineer's arrogance, and now, this bizarre, anonymous clue. "Who wrote this note?" Harrison demanded, his voice cutting through the air. David shook his head. "I don't know, sir." It was just, there. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. An anonymous genius in his midst. Or a lucky guess. It didn't matter. It was the first new lead they'd had in months. "Find out who wrote it," he commanded. "Check the security logs for the lab last night. I want to know who was in there." The search didn't take long. The security chief pulled up the footage, and there in the grainy, silent video, was the unmistakable figure of a janitor. They watched as Elena paused her cleaning, her gaze fixed on the engine. They saw her stoop to pick up the fallen paper, her long, careful study of it. They saw her walk to the workbench, write on the rag, and place it deliberately on the console before continuing her rounds. Harrison stared at the screen, a storm of emotions warring within him, disbelief, shock, and a sliver of something he hadn't felt in weeks, hope. He had walked past this woman in the hallways 100 times, and had never once truly seen her. He had seen a uniform, a function, a ghost. Now he was looking at a potential savior. "Get her," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Bring her to my office." Now the summons came as a shock to Elena. She was in the basement supply closet, refilling a spray bottle with disinfectant, when her supervisor found her, his face pale with confusion. "The CEO wants to see you," he said, the words sounding absurd even as he spoke them. Elena's first thought was that she was being fired. They knew she had touched the prototype. She had overstepped, broken the cardinal rule of her profession, be invisible. Her hands grew clammy as she rode the silent, wood-paneled elevator to the top floor. She walked into the vast, sunlit office feeling like a trespasser. Mr. Harrison sat behind his desk, a mountain of a man in a perfectly tailored suit. On the desk between them lay the greasy rag. Elena's stomach plummeted. Harrison gestured to the chair opposite him. She sat on the very edge of it, her back ramrod straight, her hands clenched in her lap. He didn't look angry. He looked curious. He pushed the rag across the desk towards her. "Did you write this?" he asked, his voice even and direct. The question hung in the air. This was her moment to deny it, to plead ignorance, to save her job. But looking at the simple, honest words on the rag, and then at the tired, desperate eyes of the man in front of her, she found a courage she didn't know she possessed. She met his gaze and gave a single, small nod. "Yes, sir." "I did." A long silence followed. Harrison studied her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet dignity in her posture. He saw a person, not a uniform. "How?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of 100 questions. "How did you know?" Elena took a shaky breath and began to speak. She told him about her father, about the garage, about learning to listen to the language of machines. She didn't use technical jargon or complex terms. She spoke of rhythm, of harmony, of feeling the engine's pain through the floor. She described the subtle, high-frequency vibration that was a symptom of the misaligned pump bracket, a flaw that was causing a chain reaction of stress on the entire system. As she spoke, the fear receded, replaced by the simple, confident clarity of the truth. Harrison listened, utterly captivated. This wasn't the language of his engineers, but it was a language of profound, intuitive understanding. He picked up his phone. "Get Marcus Vance and the lead engineering team up here." Immediately, minutes later, Marcus and his senior staff filed into the office, their faces a mixture of confusion and annoyance at being summoned so abruptly. Marcus's eyes landed on Elena, and a look of complete disdain crossed his face. He smirked. "Harrison, what is this? Is she filing a complaint about the break room coffee maker?" Harrison ignored him. He gestured toward Elena. "Ms. Flores here believes she has identified the core problem with the Helios engine. She is the one who left the note." The room fell silent. The engineers exchanged glances of pure disbelief. Marcus let out a short, derisive laugh. "Her? The janitor? Arthur, with all due respect, this is insane. We have a dozen PhDs working on this. What could she possibly know?" The dismissal was like a physical blow, but Harrison's gaze never left Elena. He had a choice to make. He could trust the expensive degrees and the arrogant confidence of the man who had failed him for 6 months, or he could take a leap of faith on the quiet woman in the gray jumpsuit who had given him his only glimmer of hope. "She knows enough to have found something you and your team of PhDs missed," Harrison said, his voice dangerously low. "So we are all going to listen." He turned to Elena, his expression a clear command. "Show them," he said. "Tell them what you told me." All eyes in the room turned to Elena. It was a crucible, a moment designed to crush her. The weight of their skepticism was suffocating. But as she looked at their faces, Marcus's sneering contempt, the other's polite disbelief, something shifted within her. It was the memory of her father, covered in grease, smiling at her. "You know this stuff, Elle. Don't ever let anyone tell you you don't." She stood up, her small stature seeming to grow. She walked to the large monitor on the wall and asked David, the young engineer, to pull up the schematic of the pump. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer a whisper. It was clear, steady, and certain. She pointed to the housing bracket. "The problem isn't in the software or the fuel injectors," she began, her finger tracing a line on the screen. "It's here. This bracket is misaligned by less than a millimeter. It's causing a constant, high-frequency vibration in the coolant pump." Marcus folded his arms, a smug smile playing on his lips. "A vibration? We've run hundreds of vibrational analyses. The sensors show nothing outside of acceptable parameters." "Your sensors are programmed to look for large, violent shudders," Elena countered, her confidence building. "They're deaf to this. This is a quiet problem. It's a hum, not a bang. But that hum is creating harmonic resonance that travels up the coolant line. It's causing microfractures in the primary turbine housing. You're not just losing power, the engine is slowly shaking itself to pieces. She explained it with such simple, irrefutable logic that the other engineers began to murmur amongst themselves, looking at the schematics with fresh eyes. They saw the connection she was making, the elegant simplicity of her theory. They had been looking for a dragon, and had missed the termite. The shift in the room was palpable. The respect was growing. And for Marcus, that was intolerable. He saw his authority, his reputation, his very identity as the resident genius, being dismantled by the cleaning lady. He had to crush this, and he had to do it now. He stepped forward, his voice booming with condescending authority. "This is a fascinating, if naive, theory," he said, patting Elena on the shoulder in a gesture of pure patronization. "And I appreciate the inspiration from our non-technical staff. In fact," he continued, turning to Harrison, his expression now one of feigned discovery, "my team was already investigating a similar resonance phenomenon in the coolant system. Her observation, while simplistic, does align with some of our more complex data." He walked to the screen, effectively pushing Elena aside. He pointed to the same area she had indicated but began spouting a torrent of technical jargon, using terms like eigenfrequency modulation and torsional stress coefficients. He was taking her pure, simple insight and wrapping it in the impenetrable armor of his own vocabulary. He was stealing her discovery in plain sight, reframing it as a minor confirmation of his own superior work. "Thank you, Ms. Flores, for your concern," Marcus said, turning to her with a dismissive smile. "You can go back to your duties now. My team and I will take it from here. We don't need a cleaner playing engineer." The words hung in the air, a brutal, public execution of her credibility. The other engineers, who had been on the verge of siding with her, now looked down, intimidated by Marcus's display of dominance. They fell back in line. Elena stood there, stunned into silence. She had been seen, heard, and believed for a glorious 10 minutes. And then, in an instant, she was stabbed in the back, made invisible once more. She looked at Mr. Harrison, her eyes pleading. But Harrison was a man under immense pressure. The company was bleeding money, and the client for the Helios engine was threatening to pull their massive contract. Marcus, for all his flaws, was his lead engineer. Risking everything on the word of a janitor against the advice of his entire department was a gamble he wasn't willing to take. He saw the logic in what Marcus was saying, or rather, he was swayed by the confidence with which he said it. Disappointment clouded his features, but he made his choice. "All right, Marcus," Harrison said, his voice heavy. "Get your team on it. Report back to me by end of day." He then looked at Elena, a flicker of apology in his eyes that was quickly extinguished. "Thank you for your input, Ms. Flores. That will be all dismissed." The word echoed in her heart. She turned and walked out of the office, the sound of Marcus confidently barking orders to his team following her down the hall. She didn't go back to her cart. She went to the quiet, empty locker room in the basement, sat on a cold bench, and let the crushing weight of her humiliation wash over her. She had dared to have a voice, and they had slapped her down for it. She had offered them the truth, and they had preferred a comfortable, credentialed lie. In the lab, Marcus's team swarmed the Helios engine. They implemented a fix based on his stolen, and critically incomplete, understanding of Elena's diagnosis. He focused solely on dampening the vibration of the pump itself, installing a new buffer and recalibrating the sensors to ignore the specific frequency Elena had identified. He addressed the symptom, not the root cause. He completely missed her crucial point about the microfractures that had already formed in the turbine housing. To him, the vibration was the disease; to Elena, it was just a cough signaling a much deeper sickness. That afternoon, the entire executive team, along with a representative from the client company, gathered in the observation deck overlooking the lab. The atmosphere was electric with nervous anticipation. This was it. The final chance. "Begin the test," Harrison ordered into the intercom, his voice tight. Marcus stood in the center of the control room, a smug, triumphant look on his face. The engine whirred to life. For a moment it sounded perfect. The low hum that had plagued the previous tests was gone. Marcus shot a triumphant glance toward the observation window. Then, a new sound began. A high-pitched whine, like screaming metal. Red lights flashed across the control panels. The engine shuddered violently, not the subtle vibration from before but a full-body convulsion. Before anyone could hit the emergency shutdown, there was a deafening crack. A plume of black smoke erupted from the main turbine housing. The engine seized with a final, gut-wrenching groan and fell silent. The failure was not just a failure, it was a catastrophe. The damage was 10 times worse than before. The client representative stood up, his face grim, and walked out without a word. The contract was lost. The room was filled with a tomb-like silence, broken only by the ringing of alarms. In that moment of total disaster, Arthur Harrison saw everything with perfect, horrifying clarity. He saw Marcus's ego, his arrogance, his intellectual dishonesty. He had trusted the suit, the title, the degree. He had trusted the man who told him what he wanted to hear, and in doing so, he had ignored the one person who had told him the truth. His mistake was going to cost him his company. A cold fury, directed as much at himself as at Marcus, settled in his chest. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. He walked out of the observation deck, his face a granite mask, and went to find the only person who could fix this. He found Elena in the basement, methodically polishing the already gleaming linoleum floor, her movements robotic, her eyes distant and empty. The sound of his expensive leather shoes on the tile made her look up. She expected to be fired, to be blamed for the distraction that led to the final disaster. Harrison stopped in front of her. He looked at her, not as a CEO to a janitor, but as one human being to another. "I am so sorry," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was absolute. "I was a fool. I listened to the wrong person. I should have listened to you." Elena just stared at him, her mop held tightly in her hands. "I need your help," he continued, his voice raw with desperation. "No, that's not right. The company needs you. I don't want you to be a consultant. I don't want you to offer advice. I am putting you in charge of a new diagnostic team. You will have full authority. You will answer only to me. Pick anyone you want on your team. You have whatever resources you need. Please. Help me save this company." The offer was so audacious, so impossible, that Elena couldn't process it at first. Her. In charge. It was a dream. But looking at the genuine remorse and desperate hope in Harrison's eyes, she knew it was real. Her gaze drifted past him, up the stairs toward the labs. She thought of David, the nervous junior engineer who had believed her. She thought of the others, the ones who had been too intimidated by Marcus to speak up, but who had listened to her with genuine curiosity. They were overlooked, just like her. They were her people. A fire she thought had been extinguished began to burn in her chest. She stood up straight, letting the mop lean against the wall. "Okay," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "I'll do it." An hour later, the doors to the main engineering lab slid open. Marcus was in the middle of shouting at his demoralized team, blaming them for the failure. Every head turned as Elena walked in. She was no longer wearing the gray jumpsuit. Mr. Harrison had given her a crisp, new lab coat, and it fit her as if she'd been born to wear it. And she wasn't alone. Walking behind her were David and 3 other junior engineers, the ones she had chosen. They were her reinforcements. They looked nervous, but their eyes shone with a fierce loyalty and a renewed sense of purpose. Marcus stared, his face turning a shade of pale white. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered. Elena walked right past him, not even giving him a glance. She addressed the room, her voice ringing with a newfound authority that commanded silence. "As of right now," she announced, "this team is in charge of the Helios project." She turned to Marcus, her eyes cold and clear. "You're relieved of duty. Please clear your workspace. Marcus was speechless, his jaw working silently. He looked to Harrison, who was standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression implacable. The message was clear. The old king was deposed, the new queen had arrived. Under Elena's guidance, the lab transformed. The atmosphere of fear and ego evaporated, replaced by one of quiet, focused collaboration. She didn't lead from a whiteboard, she led from the engine itself. She had them put away the complex simulators and listen. She taught them to use their hands, to feel for the subtle signs of stress in the metal. She spoke her father's language, and they began to understand. Together they disassembled the damaged turbine. And there, just as she had predicted, they found them, a network of tiny, almost invisible microfractures, all originating from the housing of the tertiary coolant pump. It was the smoking gun, the proof that her simple, elegant theory had been right all along. They didn't just replace the parts, they re-engineered the bracket, adding a stabilizing element that absorbed the vibration at its source. They worked for 3 days straight, fueled by coffee and a shared, electrifying sense of discovery. Finally, the moment came. Mr. Harrison stood alone in the observation deck this time. No clients, no executives. Just him. Begin the test, Elena said over the intercom, her voice calm and steady. The Helios engine spooled up. It hummed with a clean, powerful, and perfectly stable resonance. It was the sound of harmony. The sound of success. It ran for an hour, then 2, then 10, exceeding every performance metric it had ever been designed to meet. Elena and her team, covered in grease and exhaustion, looked at each other and broke into wide, triumphant smiles. They hadn't just fixed an engine. They had validated a truth, that worth is not determined by a title, and wisdom is not confined to a degree. In the weeks that followed, Harrison Dynamics was reborn. Marcus Vance was fired, not just for his failure, but for his arrogance. Elena was given a new, permanent title, Director of Diagnostic and Innovation, a position created just for her. Her team of overlooked engineers became the new core of the department, fostering a culture where every voice was heard, from the PhD to the intern. The company secured a new, even larger contract for the Helios engine, and its future was brighter than ever. Elena never lost her humility. She still walked the hallways, but now people didn't look through her, they looked to her. They saw her not as the janitor who got lucky, but as the leader who had saved them. They saw the quiet genius who had always been there, waiting for someone to finally listen. So I ask you again, have you ever felt invisible? Remember Elena. Remember that the world is full of hidden gems, of overlooked virtuosos in unexpected places. The person serving your coffee, the one driving your bus, the one cleaning your office, they all have a story, a skill, a spark of brilliance you cannot see. The greatest failure of leadership is the failure to see the potential in everyone. True strength lies not in titles or authority, but in having the wisdom to listen and the courage to lift others up. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Remind them that their worth is not defined by their job title, but by the light they carry inside. And the next time you walk past someone in a uniform, take a moment to see the person, not the position. You might just be looking at the one person who holds the answer everyone else is looking for.